Uh, well, thanks, Ellen, for the kind introduction. Thanks, Lacey, for inviting me. It's good to see so many friends here, and for those of you I haven't met before, good to meet you. Um, Obviously, this event focuses on the regional implications of the Iran deal, and I think we should start by recognizing that there's little doubt that the emergence of a nuclear-armed Iran, which this deal means to prevent, would be a profoundly destabilizing consequence for the Middle East. That's the starting point for the conversation. That an Iran equipped with a nuclear weapon would likely set off a regional arms race. It would likely be emboldened to engage even more assertively in supporting terrorism, subversion, militancy, et cetera, because it could hide behind a nuclear deterrent. And the specter of a nuclear conflict in the Middle East, a danger that doesn't exist at the moment, would rear its head. So as tumultuous as the Middle East is today, as volatile, as violent, and as bad an actor Iran is on the regional stage, all these challenges would be exponentially greater in a world where Iran acquired a nuclear weapon. That's why, from day one, the President of the United States made the prevention of a nuclear-armed Iran a top priority. I would say, with the possible exception of the wars he inherited in Iraq and Afghanistan, no other national security issue has received as much sustained high-level attention as the Iranian nuclear issue has from day one of this administration. Since he took office, the president made clear that all options are on the table to deal with this danger. And let me be precisely clear at this moment that the United States will never allow Iran to possess a nuclear weapon. But the president has been equally clear since day one that, all else being equal, a peaceful diplomatic solution is the best way to address this challenge. It's the most sustainable, the most enduring, and it avoids some of the incredible uncertainty and downside risks of many of the other options that we may face. So we've been at the diplomacy part of this the entire administration. We had our first breakthrough in November of 2013, as you all are aware, with the so-called Joint Plan of Action, the interim nuclear agreement that since that time has effectively frozen Iran's program in place. It continues to be in effect as we speak. That interim agreement was never meant to be a permanent or comprehensive deal. It was meant to buy time and space to negotiate a comprehensive solution to the Iranian nuclear challenge, which we believe was achieved on July 14th with the announcement of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which I will, from this point forward, just call the Iran deal. A deal that we believe effectively and for a very long time blocks Iran's various pathways to a nuclear weapon. Now, most of my conversation is going to be on the regional dynamics, but I think we should at least lay the predicate of what the deal actually does vis-a-vis Iran's program, because frankly, I think there's a lot of misinformation out there. I get it, it's a 159-page long agreement. Not everybody has had time to digest every element. So let me just clear away some of the clutter at the beginning. As I mentioned, the deal cuts off all of Iran's pathways to a bomb. Pathways, we should be clear, they have now and would race forward again in the absence of this deal. The first pathway is the uranium enrichment pathway, and really here we're talking about the two enrichment facilities, the large one at Natanz, the smaller one in the middle of a mountain near the holy city of Qom called Fordow. Under this agreement, Iran is limited in terms of its enrichment level to 3.67%, which is appropriate for civilian nuclear power use, but far distant from the 90% threshold necessary for weapons-grade uranium. For the next decade, this agreement will reduce Iran's centrifuges by 2/3. They have almost 20,000 now. They will only be allowed 6,000 under this agreement, only 5,000 of which will be operating. All of those operating centrifuges will be at Natanz, and all of them will be the most basic IR-1 models, no operation of advanced centrifuges. There will be no enrichment activities at Fordow, period. There will be no fissile material at Fordow. It'll be transitioned into a nuclear physics research lab. For the next 15 years, Iran's stockpile of low-enriched uranium, which currently sits at about 12,000 kilograms in various forms, For those of you following along at home, that's enough for 10 nuclear weapons if it was enriched to weapons grade level. Will be reduced from 12,000 kilograms to 300 kilograms, which is a fraction of what would be required for a single nuclear device. When you combine the reduction in their centrifuge capacity and the reduction of their stockpile together, for the next 10 years, Iran's so-called breakout time, the amount of time it would take from a political decision to race towards the fuel for one nuclear weapon would be expanded from 2 to 3 months today to more than a year. And even beyond a decade, for years beyond the decade, Iran's breakout timeline will be longer than it is today. The second path is the Plutonium Path, and here the real focus is on the Arak heavy water research reactor, which is currently constituted, is basically a plutonium factory, potentially for nuclear weapons. If construction were completed on that reactor, it would produce as many as 1 to 2 bombs worth of weapons-grade plutonium every single year. Under this deal, the reactor is redesigned so that under normal operations it produces 0 weapons-grade plutonium. All of the spent fuel, the stuff that you'd have to strip the weapons-grade plutonium off, in a misuse scenario, all that spent fuel is shipped out of the country for the life of the reactor. And Iran is not allowed for the next 15 years and says it intends not to beyond that to build a reprocessing plant, the facility you would need to chemically strip off the weapons-grade plutonium from spent fuel rods. So Arak is effectively triple-wrapped forever against the prospect of being a source of weapons-grade plutonium. By the way, I'm saying Arak, A-R-A-K, not Iraq, the country. They sound the same, but they're entirely different places. The third path, and in many respects the most troublesome given Iran's past behavior of secret nuclear activities, is the Covert Path. Under this agreement, we've achieved the most intrusive transparency and verification measures ever negotiated in an arms control or nuclear nonproliferation agreement. There's effectively 24/7 surveillance, either on-site in person or through modern technologies of all of Iran's key declared nuclear sites. There's regular access to the entire nuclear supply chain. For the next 25 years, that means inspectors have access to uranium mines and mills. For the next 20 years, they have access to not just enrichment facilities, but centrifuge production, assembly, and storage facilities. The ability of the IAEA inspectors to look over the entire supply chain means that it will be extraordinarily difficult, probably impossible, for Iran to divert materials from their declared program into a secret program. Remember, when they built the secret facility like Fordo wasn't built after they drilled the hole in the side of a mountain. It was only the Fordo enrichment facility when they were able to fill it with centrifuge components, construct them into centrifuges, and move fissile material into Fordo. Well, previously, the IAEA didn't have visibility on any of that stuff, and under this agreement, they have visibility on all of that stuff. The ability to build a son of Fordo down the road is blocked under the verification procedures in this agreement. They also will have difficulty procuring things on the black market because of the procurement channel set up under this agreement. And there are long-term prohibitions against any research into various aspects of weapons-related research and development. So, for example, for 15 years, they can't do any uranium or plutonium metallurgy, which you can't design a nuclear weapon, a warhead, without mastering uranium or plutonium metallurgy. And they have forever commitments against certain dual-use research that would be applicable, like computer modeling or high-speed cameras and things that would be applicable to the design of a nuclear warhead down the road. Those are permanent obligations. And speaking of permanent obligations, they also have a permanent obligation under the additional protocol, which they will begin implementing in the next few months if this deal moves forward, which will allow the IAEA not only to go to sites we know about, but to inspect suspicious locations as well. And there is a finite period of time in which once the IAEA requests access, if they don't get access to that facility probably within about 3 weeks, then Iran is in violation of the deal. There are also arrangements for the IAEA to get access to the facilities like Parchin that will be required to complete their investigation into the possible military dimensions of Iran's past covert nuclear weaponization program. So all of this provides the multiple layers of defense and the best possible defense against a covert path to a bomb. Now, obviously, Iran is not doing this out of the goodness of their own hearts, but are doing it in exchange for sanctions relief. I think it's really important to understand there's no signing bonus here. This is a pay-for-performance issue. Iran only receives sanctions relief under this deal once they've hit all of their key marks. That is, once they've reduced their centrifuges by 2/3, reduced their stockpile of low-enriched uranium by 98%, removed the core from the Arak heavy water reactor, implemented the additional protocol, and addressed the access issues regarding to the PMD, possible military dimensions issue. Until they do all of those things, they don't get sanctions relief under this. And at any point across the agreement, for the next 10 years, we can snap back sanctions at the United Nations, unilaterally if necessary. And we always, of course, have the ability to snap back our own sanctions on Iran if they don't comply with the agreement. Now, there have been a number of criticisms about this deal. I would say there are a number of them that would fall within the four corners of the deal. People have emphasized, what happens after year 10 or year 15, the so-called sunset provisions. People have questioned the access provisions, especially a 24-day period for getting access to an undeclared facility. There have been questions about how the snapback mechanism would work. We can talk about any and all of those in the Q&A, but I want to put those aside. We have very good answers to all of those concerns, but I'd like to focus the remainder of my remarks on the regional implications of this deal, and in particular to push back against one particular criticism of the deal, which I think falls outside the four corners of the deal, but is quite prominent among our critics. And that is the notion that this deal, and in particular the sanctions relief associated with this deal, will somehow empower Iran, enrich the coffers of the Revolutionary Guard, and enable Iranian domination of the Middle East. That it somehow unleashes, this deal unleashes a shackled Iran on the region. So let me say some things about this. I think we should first start off by being honest, all right? Honest and forthright with one another, and that is this was always going to be a challenge if we got a nuclear deal. The sanctions that were put in place and that are lifted under this agreement were not put in place to drive the regime out of business or to drive the Revolutionary Guard out of business. They were put in place to put pressure on Iran to come to the table, negotiate in good faith, and strike a deal on the nuclear program. Read the legislation. That's why they were passed. Read the executive orders. That's why they were passed. Read the UN Security Council resolutions on the nuclear issue. The sanctions were not in and of themselves. They were a means to get a nuclear deal, which means once we got a nuclear deal, the sanctions were going to come off. Right? At some point, they were going to come off. So this was always a problem we were going to have to deal with. It was baked in to the entire process. I also think we need to keep the level of sanctions relief somewhat in perspective. There's a lot of statistics being thrown out around there. I've heard frequently from outsiders, some members of Congress and others, you're going to write a check for $100 to $150 billion to Qasem Soleimani and the IRGC in a month. All right, let's be clear. What people are talking about is the money, Iran's own money, that they have trapped in basically these overseas escrow accounts in China and India and elsewhere. When Iran sells their oil under existing sanctions, the money they get from that stays in those countries in banks to fund bilateral trade. Our estimate is that there's about $100 billion of that money overseas. Now, the sanctions on being able to access that revenue will be lifted at some point if Iran comes into compliance with the agreement. This will probably not be 6 or 12 months from now because that's likely how long it will take for Iran to hit all the marks of compliance that we talked about, but at some point they'll get access to that money. But it's not $100 billion probably. Secretary Liu, our Treasury Secretary, has recently testified it's probably closer to $50 billion because they have about $20 billion of this money already dedicated, obligated towards certain Chinese projects, which they'll go forward to, and they've effectively, the rest of it's tied up in bad debt. So until they effectively pay down their national credit cards, they won't have access to that. So we think the amount of money they'll actually physically have access to is around $50 billion or so. Iranian officials have come out in the last week and suggested that it's even less than that, but our best estimate is around $50 billion. Now, what will they spend that money on? Let's be honest that nobody knows. Nobody knows what they will spend that money on. But consider a couple of facts. Iran has conservatively estimated has $500 billion in urgent domestic requirements for investment, for their budget, to get people back to work, for infrastructure. That is in excess of $500 billion of urgent requirements. Rouhani did not run for president on the platform of, I'm going to strike a nuclear deal, I'm going to get a bunch of money and give it all to Bashar al-Assad. Wasn't his campaign platform. All right? And the only reason that the supreme leader has acquiesced to this agreement is that he recognizes the enormous pent-up public expectations that sanctions relief will be dedicated to improving the economy. Right? This is about the regime. Right? That has led us to conclude, and I think our analytic community agrees with this, our Treasury Department agrees with this, that the lion's share of the money they get for a long time will have to be devoted to domestic purposes. All right? Now, that might not be right. They may choose to ignore the demands of the public and devote significantly more resources to the IRGC or to their conventional military, or maybe they'll spend most of it on the domestic economy and they'll only spend a small amount to increase the budget of the IRGC or the conventional military. The reality is that nobody knows. Another sad reality is what Iran is doing in the region is not very expensive. And all the troublemaking they're producing in places like Yemen or Syria or Lebanon or Iraq is actually not costing them very much money, which is why the sanctions we currently have in place have done nothing to change the budget or the pace of their activities in the region, because it's just not very expensive. That's a useful fact to keep in mind, because of course that means that blowing up this deal and trying to keep the sanctions in place doesn't solve the problem either. All right. This will be a challenge, deal or no deal, right? Having to contend with this activity. So what Iran ultimately spends their money on, we can have, I think, an honest debate about that. I think much will ultimately depend on what assessments one makes about the balance of power between various factions inside Iran. I could argue this round or flat, frankly. I can argue that this Iran will be a huge feather in the cap to the pragmatists, Rouhani, Zarif, and others. It may enable them to claw back issue by issue more control over hardline elements in their government as it relates to foreign policy. So maybe this will moderate Iran, if not immediately, at least gradually. I can argue it the other way, too, that Supreme Leader Khamenei is concerned about the boon this may give to moderates and may compensate by throwing the IRGC a bone. Right? The reality is none of us know which of those two scenarios, but we have to basically plan for either. And in that context, it's really important to note that this deal is not a grand bargain with Iran. It is not premised on an assumption that Iran will become a more positive actor in the region. We hope that it will. If they do, then there's opportunities for more constructive engagement, but it does not assume that they will. In fact, it assumes that Iran won't change at all. It assumes that the deal makes sense on its own merits, and we will still have to contend with all the other troublemaking that Iran has in the region. And it is conceivable they will have a little bit more money to do it. So that's the reality. It was always going to be the case, as I said, if we had a nuclear deal, but that's the reality that we all have to collectively contend with. For this reason, we must be, and we are, prepared to walk and chew gum at the same time. That is, to strike a nuclear deal with Iran and push back against Iran's destabilizing activities, which is why, even at the tensest of moments in the nuclear negotiations with Iran, our Fifth Fleet was shadowing Iranian ships, potentially delivering aid to the Houthis, lethal aid to the Houthis. We can walk and chew gum at the same time. And oh, by the way, this is precisely what we did during the Cold War. Let's remember something. I had an interesting conversation with somebody earlier today who said, Iran is the greatest rogue regime in history. And I said, well, that's interesting, because at least in my lifetime, the greatest rogue regime in history was the Soviet Union, a regime that killed tens of millions of its own people, subjugated people all throughout Eastern Europe, subverted our allies in Western Europe and throughout Asia, funded terrorism, sponsored proxies, and killed Americans, directly or indirectly, all over the world. And yet, especially from the 1970s on, Democrats and Republican presidents struck arms control agreement after arms control agreement with the Soviet Union. Not because we assumed the Soviet Union wasn't an evil empire, but because the risk of nuclear Armageddon warranted dialing the clock back for midnight a bit while we continued to push back against the Soviets in Europe, in Asia, and what was then known as the Third World. All right? We walked and chewed gum during the Cold War. We can walk and chew gum with Iran today, and we are doing that. Moreover, if Iran diverts some of the resources they get from sanctions relief to ratchet up their support for terrorism and other nefarious activities, none of our tools, our sanctions tools to go after terrorism or human rights abuses or other things, fall away as a consequence of this agreement. Entities that engage in terrorism, entities that are supported by Iran that engage in those types of activities are still sanctionable under U.S. law. You'll notice that last week we designated a bunch of Hezbollah guys for their activity in Syria, even as we're in this kind of precarious moment on the Iran deal and everything else. We can walk and chew gum at the same time. We also managed to keep the arms embargo and missile restrictions for 5 and 8 years, respectively, as a consequence of this deal. Now, there's a lot of misinformation about this, too. The arms embargo on conventional arms going into and out of Iran and the missile restrictions on their ballistic missile program are associated with a number of UNSCRs, but principally UN Security Council Resolution 1929 from 2010. That was a nuclear UN Security Council resolution of which the arms embargo and missile components were punitive measures associated with it. Right? Iran and some other members of the P5+1, including Russia, basically made the argument, look, once we suspend the nuclear activities, these things should come off. Because after all, you bootstrap them to a nuclear UN Security Council resolution. And we had to fight tooth and nail to get them extended for a single day, let alone 5 years for arms and 8 years for missiles. Now, does that mean that it's a get-out-of-jail-free card 5 years from now or 8 years from now? It doesn't. We have a bunch of other UN Security Council resolutions that are unrelated to the nuclear issue, related to Yemen, to Lebanon, to support for terrorism, to support for Shia militia groups in Iraq, that we can go after the arms trafficking issues in the same way using other vehicles at the UN. On the missile front, we have the Proliferation Security Initiative. We have unilateral sanctions that can go after entities that support Iran's missile program. So we have lots of other tools, multilateral and unilateral, in our toolkit to address these issues even down the road. And we intend to do so. Or at least I will hope the next administration continues to intend to do so. Moreover, even as we implement this nuclear deal, we're committed to expanding our already unprecedented security cooperation with Israel and our other regional partners, especially among the Gulf Cooperation Council states, to push back against Iranian threats. With Israel, as I think most of you know, despite a number of significant policy disagreements at the political level, our security cooperation is as strong as it's ever been. Ellen made reference to the fact that my previous gig in government was as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East at the beginning of the Obama administration. Over the 3 years I had that job, Israel was in my portfolio. I took 13 trips to Israel, spent almost 3 months on the ground, had more than 100 meetings with senior MOD, IDF, and political leaders across those meetings and the meetings back here in Washington, with the sole purpose, directed by the President of the United States, of making sure that our cooperation in the security and intelligence domains with Israel were as close, if not closer, than they've ever been, and would be completely unaffected by whatever drama was happening on the political side. That was true from day one of the administration. It continues to be true today, which is why the administration has provided unprecedented levels of security assistance working with Congress to Israel, more than $3 billion a year, more than $1 billion on top of that for Iron Dome and other missile defense systems, which have saved innumerable numbers of Israeli lives. Our commitment to Israel's security, including their qualitative military edge in the region, is unshakable and unquestionable, and will continue to be that way. And we've already reached out repeatedly over the last few months in the face of Israeli concerns about this deal, about what else we can do to combat Iran's destabilizing behavior elsewhere in the region. We are open to those conversations anytime, anywhere the Israelis want to have them. In fact, I was in Israel last week with Secretary Carter on just such a topic. In the Gulf, too, we've taken important steps to protect the Gulf Cooperation Council states. In May, as you all know, at Camp David, President Obama reaffirmed our longstanding security assurance to our Gulf Cooperation Council partners to defend them against external aggression, a policy that dates back to Eisenhower, Nixon, and the Carter Doctrine, and not to mention the 1991 US-led Gulf War to expel Saddam Hussein after he invaded Kuwait. Indeed, on any given day, keep in mind, as I speak, we have 35,000 forces policing the Gulf, right, to deter aggression and defend our partners. We're also working to expand GCC defensive capabilities, and deepening this cooperation was, of course, a major focus at Camp David. It is useful to keep in mind that while Iran's actions throughout the region are a major concern, as is the notion that they could spend some of the sanctions relief to bulk up their military capabilities, we need to keep this all in perspective. Iran is not an unstoppable juggernaut. They are not the equivalent of the Soviet Union, and by a lot of different measures, the balance of power in the region is not in their favor. Consider this. According to the International Institute for Strategic Studies, Iran spent nearly $15 billion on its military last year, compared to almost $115 billion spent by the GCC states. You got that right. 15 billion compared to 115 billion, not to mention the 600 billion we spent, but the 115 billion that the Saudis, the Emiratis, and others spent. And as you know, the GCC has access to cutting-edge US technology and now operates some of the most sophisticated military hardware in the world, including systems like advanced ballistic missile defense and early warning systems that are designed especially to head off Iranian threats. It's also worth noting that Israel, a country with 1/10 of Iran's population, has a higher defense budget than Iran does, and of course has the most advanced and potent military in the region. And nothing about this agreement will change that basic reality. Iran is not likely to close these quantitative or qualitative gaps, even with additional resources. So, among our GCC partners, the challenge is less about a disparity in conventional military capabilities. Rather, it is the ability of our partners to work in a more interoperable and integrated way with us and with each other. That is why a major point of emphasis at Camp David and since has been identifying steps we can take collectively to improve things like integrated early warning and air and missile defense, and also improve cooperation in the maritime domain. We can also do more to enable our GCC partners to address irregular and asymmetric threats to their security, and we're committed to doing that. That is why we focused at Camp David and since on ways to improve cyber defenses and the protection of critical infrastructure. It is also why we are committed to improving counterterrorism cooperation with the GCC, building their special operations capabilities, and working to develop regional forces that can focus on missions like stabilization and peacekeeping. It's also important to understand that many of Iran's gains in recent years are more a byproduct of weaknesses in surrounding states where Iran and its proxies operate, rather than a manifestation of Iran's inherent strengths. The solution to this challenge, and this was another major theme at Camp David, is to work with the GCC and others in the region and the international community to build stronger partners and pursue political solutions that help stabilize key countries. That's why in places like Iraq and Lebanon, where Iran attempts to use proxies to exercise undue influence and build parallel institutions, we will continue our work to strengthen national institutions and militaries to help them combat violent extremists while hardening them against foreign interference. It's also why in places like Syria and Yemen, we will continue to promote political transitions and inclusive power sharing arrangements to end the violence in those countries and ensure that all parties, not just Iran's proxies, have a say in governance. And that's why it is imperative, even as we deepen our security and diplomatic cooperation with GCC states, for our Gulf partners to constructively engage Iran and explore ways to de-escalate regional tensions in places like Yemen and Syria and tamp down the sectarian polarization that is ripping the region apart. Look, this deal is not perfect. It won't solve every problem in the Middle East. It wasn't designed to solve every problem in the Middle East. Iran, in all likelihood, will still cause trouble, and they may have some extra cash to do it. So we'll have to address that. And we have a plan to do it, and we're moving out on that plan to do it. But as challenging as they may be in the region today, it pales in comparison to the regional consequences of a nuclear-armed Iran. So let's keep that in perspective. I won't tell you who this conversation was with, but I had it repeatedly. It could have been in 2009, 2010, 2011. I say could have been, not because I don't remember, but because it happened each one of those years, with senior members of the Israeli Defense Forces. And they would say, Colin, you just don't understand. You think Iran is difficult to manage now. They would become unmanageable if they had a nuclear weapon. And they said, Colin, what would happen if we had a rerun of the 2006 war in Lebanon, except this time Iran extended a nuclear umbrella over Hezbollah? Think of all that they would do in terms of providing even more advanced systems, of pushing the envelope on accepting risk, on the risks that would pose for a regional conflagration if we refought the 2006 Lebanon war in the shadow of a nuclear-armed Iran. So Colin, no matter what you do, make sure that you stop Iran from getting nuclear weapons, because everything else in the conventional and asymmetric domain pales in comparison to that. It's a useful conversation to keep in mind. This deal is designed to address that danger. And a no-deal scenario at this point, let's be honest, would make the danger far worse. If Congress blows up this deal at this moment, Iran will get back on the path to a bomb. How do I know that? Because that's what happened the last two times diplomacy collapsed, in 2005, 2006, and in 2010. Their breakout time is already 2 or 3 months. If Iran exploits the collapse of this deal to move forward on its nuclear program, starts installing and operating not just more centrifuges, but more advanced centrifuges, starts reaccumulating 20% so-called medium-enriched uranium, starts enriching perhaps to higher levels, 60% for nuclear propulsion or something. All steps they could do quickly with their existing infrastructure. The breakout time doesn't stay at 2 or 3 months. It rapidly shrinks to a handful of weeks or days. That's what happens without this deal. It doesn't go for a decade of more than 12 months of breakout. It doesn't go to 15 years where we're in a better position than we are today and where no option is off the table if they rush for a bomb. That collapse in the breakout window happens in the next 10 or 15 months, not the next 10 or 15 years. Let's be honest about that. And in the absence of this deal and the support from the world that comes with it, because let's be clear, this is not a deal between the United States and Iran. This is a deal between the United States, Great Britain, France, Germany, China, Russia, and Iran, and 99% of the world supports this deal. Right? In the absence of this deal and the support from the world that comes with it, our options to address an Iran that is rapidly approaching the nuclear threshold, and could do so in very short order, in the very near future, our options will narrow dramatically. More sanctions will not be an option, despite what our critics assert. We will have enormous difficulty even maintaining the existing sanctions. Because as our Treasury Department will tell you, it's not just the threat about denial from the US market that keeps people on side, it's the political consensus around the rationale for the sanctions of driving Iran to a nuclear deal, a threat that China and Russia and others in the Europeans agree is a problem. Well, we've got a nuclear deal. They expect the sanctions to come off. Their willingness to cooperate with us to continue to strangle the Iranian economy when they want to buy their oil and they want to get back into business, I don't have a lot of confidence we can even maintain the existing sanctions. In fact, I think the most likely scenario is that the sanctions regime implodes altogether. But let's imagine that's wrong. Let's imagine all it does is erode. Okay, so we blow up this deal. The sanctions regime doesn't explode or implode. I don't take your pick. It simply erodes. Do we have more leverage or less leverage than we have today? Raise your hand if you think we have less leverage with less sanctions. It's not a trick question. How do we drive to a better deal with less leverage? I mean, by the way, this notion that there's this better deal out there that drives them to zero capacity forever is a fantasy. The Bush administration tried to achieve that in 2005, 2006. Iran walked away from the table and their program went through the stratosphere. So we've run that play before. But let's imagine you think the deal could be a little bit better. It could be fine-tuned here, fine-tuned there, reduction in capacity here, better inspections there. How do you achieve a better deal with less leverage and no support from the world? So that's not going to be the way that this pans out. If the Congress blows up this deal at this moment, our options will be to try to cobble together as much of the sanctions regime as possible while Iran creeps or rushes close to the nuclear threshold, and then we will face a military confrontation. We will face the choice between the bomb or the bombing. A military solution, while viable, isn't going to buy you 10 or 15 years. It's not going to reduce their stockpile by 98%. It doesn't produce the type of meaningful constraints on their program or verification that this agreement does. But it would unleash a whole heck of a lot of trouble in an already troubled region. Is that the road that we think is better for the region? I don't think so. So in conclusion, look, I've said let me be clear a lot. Let me be clear one last time. We think this is a good deal. It's a good deal in isolation of anything else. It's good for our security. It's good for the security of our allies. It's good for the region. It doesn't solve every problem, but we can manage the problems that it doesn't address. So we think this is a good deal in and of itself. But when you compare it to the most likely alternatives to this deal, it is a very good deal. And it's the best available option to address one of the most significant and most long-standing security challenges that any of us have faced. Thanks.
Are you happy to take questions
Happy.
from there?
As many as fire away.
Oh.
Ma'am.
Diane Perlman from the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason. So you mentioned there are sort of there's common thinking is there are two possibilities that either this could empower the moderates or it could empower the hardliners. I'd like to suggest a third option, which is that it opens up a potential, but it's up to us and how we treat them, and that we have some effect on which way that goes. So if we treat them with respect and start reducing tension and reducing fears and threats, that it's more likely to open the door for something, which is called in systems theory a second order change, where you work on the relationship system, causing it with the causes rather than the symptoms. So maybe instead of just walking and chewing gum, we could eat a few hors d'oeuvres together, or maybe a few pistachios for starters.
Well, Diane, I think it's an important point. And there's a little bit of a chicken and egg issue here. And I don't think we should either underrate but probably not overrate our ability to impact or affect the balance of power between the various factions inside Iran. I think we need to be honest with ourselves that Rouhani and Zarif have had considerable influence over the nuclear file, but most of the rest of Iran's foreign policy in the region is dominated by the Revolutionary Guard, not by them. So the balance of power will matter. I don't think ultimately we can impact that directly. I think the point, and this goes to your issue, the point we have been clear on is that if Iran does start to behave in a more moderate fashion in places like Syria or Yemen or elsewhere, that we're open to having the same type of constructive engagement in the same spirit that we had in the nuclear arena to find solutions that address our interests and the security of our allies and partners in the region with Iran. We hope Iran moves in that direction, because we think we can now have a conversation with them, and frankly, we need the Gulf states to have a conversation with them too. That means the Saudis and others, because a lot of what's going on in Syria or Iraq or Yemen is ultimately not going to be resolved until they start having constructive conversations. So does this deal open up a window to have conversations like that? It does. In the absence of this deal, does that window slam shut? It might. Is it inevitable that it'll happen? A lot of that depends on, the ball is a little bit in Iran's court. If they start to moderate their behavior, then we're open. But if they double down on their activities in Yemen and Syria and elsewhere, or their support for Hezbollah threats to Israel, then we're going to double down on how we're pushing back against what they're doing. Sir.
Peter Humphrey, Intel analyst and former diplomat. You say that if we don't get this deal, that Iran will surge forth to construct a nuclear weapon.
I didn't actually say that, but I said that they could creep or dash closer to the nuclear threshold.
Iran swears by all that's holy that it has never had an intention to build a nuclear weapon. It does not have an intention to build a nuclear weapon, and it will not have an intention to build a nuclear weapon. So does that mean you don't trust Iran?
I think the reality is the world doesn't trust Iran.
So then why are we being shackled with an inspection regime that is orders of magnitude worse than UNSCOM in Iraq?
So first of all, there's never been an inspections regime in the history of negotiated agreements that is more transparent and verifiable than this one. Never. Hold on. You mentioned UNSCOM in Iraq. You're smart guys, worked on this issue. How did we get Saddam to agree to that? We defeated him decisively in a war in 1991. Unconditional surrender at the feet of the Allies, right? So is that the path we should go down to get Iran to capitulate?
You admit that the regime being proposed is infinitely weaker
Nope.
than UNSCOM.
I said it's not the same as what we had in Iraq because the circumstances are apples and oranges.
Just compare the two regimes. Which is stronger and which is weaker?
What I said was it's an apples and oranges comparison because the type of system we had in Iraq was never going to be on the table in Iran because they were not defeated in a war. And the point, and I will stand by this,
Question.
sir,
Please.
I'm trying to be respectful to you. It'd be helpful if that was a two-way street. Okay? My point, and this is historically accurate, is that there has never been as intrusive and verifiable, negotiated agreement on arms control and nuclear nonproliferation as this one, right? The Iraq comparison is not a good one because we defeated them in a war and forced them into an unconditional surrender. And that was never an option in this case. Unless
No, no.
the collective you are willing to sign up to invade a country of 70 million people with Afghanistan's terrain and everything else. The real question is whether this is the best or only the second best in history. Is it good enough? We have 24/7 surveillance of their key nuclear sites. For the first time and the only place on Earth, we have coverage of the complete nuclear supply chain. Right? You can't move uranium ore or yellowcake or uranium hexafluoride or components for centrifuges from their known facilities to unknown ones, which they've been able to do for the entire history of their program in the context of this deal without the IAEA detecting it near instantaneously. Okay? And if one is worried about Iran being untrustworthy, building a secret program, and we worry about that, it's not about trust. We don't trust them. It's about verification. The president has been clear on that. And there is no world in which you get more insight into their program, more intrusive inspections, more ability to verify their obligations under the NPT. There is no alternative to this deal that gets you more. More sanctions don't do it for the reasons I've already explained. You can't get to a better deal with less. Military action doesn't do it. For one thing, it wouldn't hit the secret sites we don't know about. And it's certainly not going to improve their access by hitting surgical strikes. That's not the type of unconditional defeat that Saddam that we talked about in the context of Saddam. So on the merits, the consensus of the vast majority of arms control experts and nonproliferation experts who have pored over this agreement says that it's the best one we've ever achieved on that score. Sir.
Thank you, Dr. Kahl. My name is Ali Martinez. Thanks a lot. I'm Ali Martinez. I'm with the West Asia Council. Very quickly, I think it's safe to say that it was the sanctions and the engagement of leading Iranians that made the deal possible. The fact that over the past 20 months, leading U.S. officials, Secretary Kerry, Undersecretary Sherman, and then Secretary Moniz, and of course Secretary Liu, were involved in reaching out to this country, directly or indirectly. The question is, now that we're in the implementation stage, what happens to that engagement dimension of the bilateral relationship between the U.S. and Iran? And in a related vein, who are the key Iran-focused officials in the Obama administration? I know you're one of them, but then I know the president himself is very interested in the details of this deal, because some folks have been talking about the possibility of the appointment of an Iran special coordinator who might be able to carry her or his mandate into the next administration. Thank you.
Yeah. So I think we're not going to see an overnight transformation in the bilateral relationship. You know, embassies opened and normal diplomatic relations. I do think what has been established through this deal is, you know, when I was a U.S. official at the beginning of the administration, I couldn't go to a cocktail party if there was an Iranian official there, right? Because of fear that we would like bump into each other at the hors d'oeuvres table. And now it's regular happenstance for, circumstances for the Secretary of State and the Foreign Minister of Iran to talk on the phone or meet in Vienna or New York or wherever it is. Those are channels of communication that are useful, not just with friends, but with adversaries, because there are a lot of other conflicts that we have with Iran in the region, and those channels of communication, I hope, will prove fruitful. But a lot, again, and this goes back to Diane's question too, a lot depends on whether Iran is open to having fruitful conversations in other domains, and that is TBD. As it relates to the administration's engagement, you're right that it's been from top to bottom. I mean, you've undoubtedly seen the President of the United States, not just in speeches, but in these press conferences. I mean, he has 100% complete ownership over this policy, its details. His arms have been since day one and continue to be fully wrapped around this. It's why, even for the last couple of months, even as Wendy Sherman and Secretary Kerry and others have been trying to get us across the goal line on the deal, we've had a second team, completely separate, working on what would be necessary to actually implement it. And we continue to refine those because we have a period of months as the implementation kicks through. And there will be a senior official associated with that to make sure that we have someone who's got eyes on a daily basis and access to the highest levels of our government to move forward on implementation. Because this thing doesn't get wrapped up just because we have a deal. It actually has to be implemented not only on their side.
Coordinator appointment has not been decided yet.
I don't know. This is one of those areas where I've seen some reports in the press, but I don't know if we've actually announced anything, so I don't want to get ahead of my skis, especially on camera. Over here.
Yeah,
Yes, oh, sorry. Ted Katouf, Amet East. It's given the partisan atmosphere in Washington, it's understandable that Republicans, almost to a representative or a senator, are going to oppose this deal. But there's also Democrats out there. Robert Menendez's name comes to mind, but I'm sure there are others that are also opposed. I realize you may not handle the politics, the domestic politics of this, but nevertheless, how difficult do you see it to get a sufficient number of Democratic senators to vote for this to ensure that it's veto-proof?
I think you're absolutely right on the Republican side. I think the days of partisanship ending at the water's edge are long gone. I don't know if they ever existed, but they haven't existed recently. Clearly, the Republicans are outbidding one another on how opposed they are to this. I don't hear a lot of alternatives, frankly, coming from the Republican side of the aisle, other than the frankness of Senator Cotton, who basically says the alternative to this is going to war, and war would be better.
Does he have any kids of draft age?
Well, he's served in our military. I think he deserves our respect, but on this issue, he's I think wrong and dangerously so. But I do think it's a little bit of a window. It's interesting that you've had some former senior officials like John Bolton come out recently and also say, look, the notion that there's you could blow up this deal, increase sanctions, and get to a better deal. Come on, let's all admit that's a fantasy. The only alternative to this is war. Now Bolton thinks a war would be a good idea. Right. But at least I think he's honest about where he wants us to go. Look, I think the politics for Democrats, it's tough, and I think it's a case by case depending on what's going on in a particular constituency and a particular state. So I'm not sure it's useful to make generalities. Clearly, the Democrats are somewhat divided. I think that you have to uphold you have to have enough in the Senate or enough in the House, either, to prevent an override of a presidential veto. This is a top priority for the president. I think we are confident that enough Democrats not only will understand the merits of the deal and be convinced by that, but also understand just the sheer importance of this and all that will be able to sustain enough votes to prevent a veto override of a resolution of disapproval. I think it's also worth keeping in mind that, I mean, we talked a lot about what would happen in the Iran side of things if Congress blows up this deal. I think there are some real issues we need to think through about what some of the broader implications are for our foreign policy if they blow up this deal, because you know, the vice president says a lot, and I've experienced this as well, that when you travel abroad, one of the questions you get, and it doesn't matter where you are, is can you govern? Is the partisanship and gridlock and disorder in this town so profound, can you get anything done? And I think the answer will be quite problematic if Congress blows up a deal that was a decade in the making, almost 2 years of intensive negotiations, and has the support of the most powerful countries on Earth, and probably 99% of all the countries on Earth. And Congress blows that up afterwards. It'll raise real questions, I think, about our ability to lead, not just this administration, any administration. So I hope that that's a broader set of considerations that folks on the Hill also take, separate from the merits of the deal, which I think are strong.
Should I take one more?
Sure.
Is there,
All right, right here, sir.
I'm David Mack of the Middle East Institute. For understandable reasons, you've concentrated on a lot of short-term ways in which the Congress's consideration of this is going to be either helpful or problematical. And I think it's very normal for Americans to look at things in 2-year or 4-year cycles, because that's the way our government works. I hope that when we're dealing with Israeli strategic thinkers rather than people who are concerned about their daily electoral politics, and when we're dealing with Arab leaders, that we focus on some very long-term effects of what might happen. I think that Americans tend to have an optimistic view of the future that gets us in trouble when we deal with Israelis and with Arabs, because we think that given enough time, you're going to have progress. The world will improve. I think that for good historical reasons, Israelis and Arabs think that the future is more likely to bring disaster of some kind. And for a lot of Arabs, at least, their concern is that they're going to lose U.S. strategic cooperation. And I think you did a good job of pointing out reasons why that's not so likely. But I think there is, and you mentioned a good historical analogy in terms of the Soviet Union, but I think a better one is China. I am not an expert on Far East history, but I suspect there was consternation among strategists in Tokyo and Seoul and Manila when Nixon went to China. Now the reality is that was 4 decades ago. Do we have a intimate relationship with China? Well, it's no longer an adversary relationship, but it sure as heck is competitive. And we still have strong security cooperation and protection for those long-term allies of ours. So I hope that we can, when we get away from our domestic debate, we can focus on some of these longer-term issues. I, for one, don't expect that we're going to have a great improvement in relations with Iran anytime very soon. But at least we could get away from the adversary type of relationship that we've had for longer now than we had with China.
Yeah, let me do it in reverse order. I'm not a China expert either. And frankly, whether one historical analogy is the better one, I don't know. I think that what we saw from the China experience was that it was a tremendous but highly controversial strategic opportunity. And it was one that Nixon seized on because there was a rift between China and the Soviet Union, and this was a way to not only in some way develop a relationship with China, which was a very important country, but to drive a wedge even further between China and the Soviet Union. And it was very much in the context of the Cold War. And so it's hard for me to, it's not an apples to apples thing. And it is true that our relationship with China has moved in a dramatically different direction. China itself is also a dramatically different country than they were at the time. Is there a possibility that you could see an analogous trend line in our relationship with Iran? Possibility, but not an inevitability. And the point in my remarks was to say we have to hedge for either possibility. Not foreclose opportunities for more constructive engagement with Iran if they moderate their behavior, but let's not be naive. The safest assumption is that they won't, at least not right away, and that we're going to continue to have to push back. On the long-term strategy bit, and then Ellen, I'm sorry, I'll cede the floor to the panel, but look, I think it's hard for anybody in the region to do long-term strategy at the moment because with all the violence and turmoil, it creates a lot of short-termism, right? The time horizons are pretty short given all that's going on. It's kind of hard to focus on the horizon when everything is right here. But I know that there are some concerns that somehow the Iran deal will either lead us to pivot away from the Middle East altogether, because we're done, now we get to go home, or within the Middle East somehow pivot to Iran and away from our traditional allies. I can say neither one of those things is going to happen under this administration or any administration I can see coming into office in the foreseeable future. That we can rebalance to Asia and stay fully engaged in the Middle East, which is what we're doing presently and can continue to do. We are starting to lay the foundation, I think, of a long-term strategy that seeks to reassure our partners and our commitments to their external defense, but also, frankly, seeks to build the architecture for more interoperability, coalition activities between us and them, and importantly, building up their own capabilities to defend themselves over the long term, right? And I talked about that, and that was a major theme at Camp David. The last point I would make is we're not the only ones who need a long-term strategy. The countries in the region need a long-term strategy. Mm-hmm. And look, parts of the region are careening into the abyss. Internal turmoil, civil wars that have involved all of the neighbors, both by sucking them in and having refugees and economic and extremist challenges spilling out. The countries of the region, Iran, but also countries like Saudi Arabia and others, have to realize that it's in their self-interest to have their own conversation and to start to de-escalate and move towards a more sustainable equilibrium in the region. Whether this deal makes that more or less likely is to be determined. But whether it does or it doesn't, it has to happen. There has to be a basic understanding reached among the regional powers that what's going on in Syria, what's going on in Iraq, what's going on in Yemen is not in anybody's interest ultimately, that the entire house is going to burn down around them while people are fighting over the title. Right? And the last point I would make is a lot of these countries have to have a long-term strategy at home for dealing with the fundamental governance challenges which give rise to groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIL or Hezbollah or the Houthis, and that are the source of all the grievances that drove the Arab Spring, which we no longer really refer to as very spring-like, the Arab uprisings. Those fundamental grievances, tensions, the need for political and economic reform, none of those long-term requirements for stability in the region have dissipated as the Arab Spring has taken a darker turn. So I hope that our partners in the region are mindful of that as well. Thanks.